again. Thank you very much for being here. It is with great pleasure that I welcome you to the event, The Impact of Drug Control on Women, Exacerbating Violence and Human Rights Abuses. This event is organized by the International Drug Policy Consortium, the Washington Office on Latin America, el Centro de Estudios Legales y Sociales, Corporación Humanas Chile y Conectas, and it is co-sponsored by the permanent missions of Colombia, Costa Rica, and Uruguay. All over the world, the prohibitionist approach to drugs is breaching most of the human rights and fundamental freedoms set out in the Charter of the United Nations, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, and international human rights treaties. Too often, drug users suffer discrimination. They are harmed by approaches which overemphasize criminalization and punishment, while underemphasizing harm reduction and respect for human rights. Human rights are therefore challenged, and particular groups, such as women and children, have been adversely affected by responses that are focused solely on law enforcement, leading to harmful social consequences. Punitive drug control policies have not only failed to reduce the scale of the illicit drug market, but also resulted in an exacerbation of violence, discrimination, poverty, and marginalisation against women. Today, women are the fastest growing Christian population worldwide, often incarcerated for low-level, non-violent drug-related offences. Most incarcerated women are from poor, disintegrated households with little or no access to education or employment opportunities, and with life stories that are marked by multiple forms of abuse and violence. Many are single mothers, responsible for several children and other dependents. Their incarceration can, therefore, have a significant impact on their lives, but also on the lives of their families and communities. At UNGASS 2016, we have renewed the momentum to reframe the debate towards a human rights and development perspective or approaches. It is therefore critical for us to build on these gains in the coming years. Through the outcome of UNGASS, we have recommitted to ensure that national drug policies, as part of a comprehensive, integrated, and balanced approach, fully respect all human rights and fundamental freedoms and protect the health, safety, and well-being of individuals. And I underline this commitment because it is not the first time that we have reaffirmed it. We have also committed to ensure that detained women have access to adequate health services and counseling, including during pregnancy. We have also committed to mainstream a gender perspective and ensure the involvement of women in programs. We have committed to adopt alternative or additional measures with regard to conviction or punishment and to promote proportionate national sentences policies of drug-related offenses. We have also committed to take into account the specific needs and possible multiple vulnerabilities of women drug offenders when in prison, in line with the Bangkok rules. So these particular commitments that I have highlighted are part of an agreed framework, and our challenge now is to implement them. Let me very briefly refer to my country. Uruguay has put the gender perspective high on its agenda by including it in its national drug strategy, also in its policies related to prevention, treatment, and inclusion, as well as by developing dedicated positive actions to overcome forms of gender vulnerability and inequality related to drugs. Particular focus has been given to mainstreaming gender perspective in the cases of women-deprived offences. Also by strengthening the institutional framework with the participation of all relevant stakeholders, including civil society. And through the commitment to international and regional initiatives, there are many that are going on right now, and we have committed to participate in it. As well as, and I underline this, that this is very important, by producing specific studies and collecting to better understand the root causes and the trends, and to consequently inform targeted public policies to deal with the specific situation of women incarcerated by drug offenses. But still, even we have done all this work, an important challenge remains ahead of us. So with this introduction and without further ado, I will now invite our distinguished panelists to take the floor, reminding them to stick to the time limit of more or less 10 minutes for their intervention, so as to allow us to debate on this very important issue. We will start with Paulo de Tarso Benaventes, who is the Geneva representative of CELS, Conectas, and Humanas. Paulo will be giving us an overview of the impact of overly punitive drug policies on the exacerbation of violence against women. So, Paulo, please, you have the floor.
Thank you very much. Good afternoon. Thank you for coming. I will propose first an introduction on what's called the war on drugs and its impact on general on human rights, specifically on women's rights, in particular in incarcerated. Just to set the context, we're talking about a law on equality and discrimination that has a broader scope. So we're talking about discrimination not only by purpose but on effect, and that has overall several impacts on the law of the state responsibility. As we see in our projection, it entails a public and positive obligation on states, violations even for ineffective policies. So it's not enough to any policy, but the policy has to be effective. And that we see very clear on Article 2 of CEDAW, General Policy Measures. Article 5 CEDAW, the obligation on the states to eliminate cultural patterns that allow stereotypes against women's rights. And to the extent that some policies may violate rights even if are well intended. Of course, here we're talking on disproportionate impact without an objective and reasonable justification, and it's more than natural to speak of CEDAW's General Recommendation 19, which is under review currently. It brings gender violence as a very serious form of discrimination against women, breaches civil, political, and economical rights, of course, touches upon stereotyped roles, situations of vulnerability such as poverty, women in conflicts, women in rural zones, and they need to revise these policies. A number of countries have put in place the so-called war on drugs that has led to an escalation of violent conflicts. They take place in areas that are already impoverished, so they further deteriorate living conditions and stigmatizing the persons living in those areas, be them jungle areas, slums, any setting where this area takes place. So it has also broadened the social gaps and stereotypes through several means. It has relied greatly on penal law as a deterrent, if not the only, as the most significant policy, and of course has exacerbated incarceration of both men and women, and leading to a penitentiary crisis, not only in Latin America, but worldwide. Last year, as requested by the Human Rights Council, for the first time, the Office of the High Commission for Human Rights has published, after consultations, a comprehensive report, bringing upon the human rights approach, human rights impact or consequences of some drug policies. We can very broadly speak on the right to life. 33 countries impose death penalties. When they don't officially enforce death penalty, we have extrajudicial killings. Right to personal integrity through militarization of security or abuse of power to extract confessions from drug dealers. Naturally, the right to health. Whenever you see stigmatization against substance dependence and risking policies on HIV for HIV positive persons, denial of harm reduction. So, in this very broad scope, we go to the next stage of our conversation and see, what's going on with women in prison. So, a research conducted in 2016 has concluded first that prison is, by definition, a male space. So, worldwide, the female prison ranges from 5 to 7 up to 8%. But at the same time, it's the fastest growing gender in prison population. We've seen an escalation of ranging 400% in some countries. There are worrying global rates of incarceration of drug-related offenses. In our region, Latin America, around from 60 to 80%. Europe and Central Asia, 1 to 4 female inmates are there due to drug-related offenses. In Thailand, reaches 8%. The CEDAW has taken a look at that and has raised the question whether this will be indicated for women's poverty. Has requested collection of data of women drug users in prison. So we come here with a question on whether there is the feminization of drug trafficking being just one ramification of the whole set of possibilities of feminization of poverty. UNGASS, together with some partners, have conducted research in 2015 in Chile, Colombia, Mexico, to have a look at the main profile of these female inmates. So typically small quantities, what is called the micro-trafficking, involving non-violent acts. Most of them, as has been said already, young and illiterate caregivers or dependents on psychotropic substances. So they sell drugs as a means to finance their own consumption. Either they have already intimate relations with traffickers and they end up in trafficking because of non-planned pregnancy, through economic pressure, and of course, lack of better alternatives. Either it can be a family business, so it runs naturally, or a sort of side entrepreneurship. They have underpaid positions or long working hours, and they want some extra incomes, for amenities, sneakers, clothes, toys for her children, a bit better than the raw basic. Then we'd like to propose what's really the dynamics of incarceration. Again, women are expected to be good, so nurturing, caregiving. So drug trafficking for women is not really natural, for women. They've expected a female role in society. So we see them entering into this business through force or deception. So either the big drug dealers threaten them or family members. They run a very high risk of rupture of the capsules that they ingest to go through. They are at the lowest level of criminal structure, so not profiting very much from this business. And then when incarcerated, frequently become users to cope with the harsh prison considerations. And of course, once in prison, the family situation, becomes unstable, reinforcing, breaking family ties and stability. We see also a very excessive approach on pre-trial detentions. There are specific exceptions. For example, the case of Mexico that provides that takes into consideration breastfeeding or family caring of the role of the victim. But this is not a general concession. It's on a discretionary basis. Right? Of course, bailing is very unaffordable. Can take to $1,000. So it's really difficult for them to go on trial while in liberty. And also very vulnerable clusters. In Brazil, 50% of women related to drug trafficking are African descendants. In the US and Canada, African American women are 7 times more likely to be arrested than the white counterparts. In Argentina, 90% of the foreign female inmates, they served as courier or what's called offering the mules. It's a bit pejorative nowadays. Gender stereotyping in criminal proceedings. The seat of has touched upon many times, but more specific on gender recommendation. It's 33. And provision of legal defense counsel are, on a barely formal. Very frequently, they see the defense counsel only at the day or a few minutes before the hearing. They are automatically advised to plead guilty as charged, so having no time to discuss their strategies on defense, and very little or no understanding of the procedures. We heard an experience of a lady who was asked, so you're going to appeal, so you're going to Buenos Aires, and she didn't know how to reply what Buenos Aires meant at that very specific, context. Whenever a female defendant appeals on the motive that she has a family to run, then stereotypes come and say that you should have known the consequences once you decided to separate from the family. And of course, there's a very high trend of imposing blanket minimum sentence on women, more than on men. So we come up with the conclusion that there are insufficient in some countries, but if any, in other countries none, specific public policies to take into account the differentiated need of women and the disparate impact that these punitive drug policies effect on women. There's also a need to further examine the factors and dynamics that lead women to be involved in drug related crimes. So with that slide, I thank you.
Thank you very much, Paulo. Thank you for bringing in the human rights approach as a framework to deal with the war drug problem, reminding us of our legal obligations. And I would also like to underscore the need to design differentiated policies that you have highlighted, addressing the specific needs of women in relation to the war drug problem. As the sentence that you have put, prison is by definition as a male space. This gives us the idea that we have really to take into account the specific needs of women and the dynamics of vulnerability that you have underscored of women incarcerated. So thank you for that. I will now turn to Marie Mouguet from the International Drug Policy Consortium. She will be making us a presentation of the main conclusions of the Guide for Policy Reform in Latin America and the Caribbean, on the issue of women, drug policies, and incarceration. And I don't know if you have seen, there are some copies of these guides outside the room. If you would like to have them. Marie, please, you have them.
Thank you very much. And for those who don't have a copy of the guide, we actually have some postcards which have the link of the guide in English and in Spanish. And as you'll see outside, there's also a copy of the guide that was created on the basis of this regional guide, but specifically for Colombia. And this one is available in English, but also in Spanish. So thank you so much, Christina, for the introduction. So my name is Marie, and I work for the International Drug Policy Consortium, which is a global network of NGOs that work specifically on drug policies. And we have, for a long time, tried to influence the UN processes in Vienna in particular, because that's where all the decisions on drugs are being taken. But we thought, and in particular in the light of the UNGASS, that it would be relevant and pertinent to continue a dialogue on the issues of women incarcerated, drug policy, and human rights in Geneva as well. So next, please. So I think Paolo's presentation and Christina's introduction have been very good in terms of trying to highlight some of the key vulnerabilities that are faced by women in Latin America. There's, as Paolo said, 60 to 90% of women in some countries in Latin America are in prison for drug offences. And as Paolo also highlighted, this is not necessarily only in Latin America, but it's a trend that we can see in other regions as well, in particular in Central Asia and in Southeast Asia. So I would like to start this presentation by actually sharing with you a lived story, so the story of a woman who we interviewed in Costa Rica, just to kind of give a human face of the issue and really highlight some of the key vulnerabilities that women there are facing every day. So Paolo, if you could pass this next slide. Next one. Paolo? The next one. Thank you. So this is Sarah. Sarah is a woman who is currently incarcerated in the prison of Buen Pastor in San Jose, Costa Rica. And she is right now incarcerated for selling small quantities of crack, but also attempting to bribe a police officer with around $4. Next slide, please. So at the age of 13, Sarah left school and ran away from home to escape sexual abuse from her uncle. The boy she ran away with was also abusive, and she fled with him at the age of 15. She fled from him at the age of 15 and was forced to sexually exploit herself to survive. Next slide. Sarah spent most of her time living on the streets. She began using drugs and became involved in criminal activity to support her habits. Life on the streets was very dangerous. One day, she was attacked by a violent man. She had refused to sell drugs to and beaten with a board full of rusty nails. So I quote, "I don't know how long I was lying on the ground, but they said when the ambulance arrived and the nurse told the boy who had helped get me onto the stretcher that a few minutes more and I would have been dead." Next. Eventually, Sarah was sent to jail. When released, she fell back into using and selling drugs. She is now 50 years old, serving a plea bargaining sentence for drug trafficking, plus an additional 1 year and 8 months for attempting to bribe the arresting officer with the equivalent of $3.75. She still hopes for a better future. Next. I quote, "When I leave here, I'm going to stay with my little sister and get a job somewhere, but I don't want to go back to working illegally, and much less consuming drugs, because my sister really needs me." Next. So Giselle Amador is a medical doctor and senior advisor for the Costa Rican Association for Research and Intervention in Drugs, or ACID. So they're working in Costa Rica and doing very good work in terms of drug policy. So she met with Sarah during a recent visit to Buen Pastor prison and says that her case is not uncommon. It serves as an example of the cycle many women get caught up in. And I quote, "Since childhood, Sarah has been suffering a lifetime of violence and violations of her basic rights, physical and sexual abuse, repeated pregnancies, and finally confinement in prison for selling small amounts of crack, all completes the picture of vulnerability. So if you could put the next slide. So that's the kind of stories that we are confronted with every day in prisons in Costa Rica. And because of this big situation of vulnerability that we see across so many people incarcerated, IDPC and a number of other organizations, including the Washington Office on Latin America, the Inter-American Commission on Women of the OAS, ACEID, de Justicia y Corporación Humanas, have put together a working group of expert people from the region, so men and women working on issues related to gender, relating to criminal justice, related to prisons, drug policies, human rights. And these people came from a variety of sectors, so there's NGOs, but there's also academics, public defenders, and government officials. And the objective of that working group was to try to find solutions to reduce the rate of incarceration of vulnerable women across the country and across Latin America in general. Next, please. So in February 2016, we released this guide for policy reform. And as I said, you have a link to that guide on the poster and the little flyer that's outside. And so the objective of this and the underlying principle of that guide is that prison should really be used as a last resort, in particular for women, and in particular for women who are in situation of vulnerability. Another couple of key principles for that guide is that a gender perspective should really inform any kind of design, implementation, and evaluation of drug policy. And so far, that's been mainly absent from the debates at international level, but also at regional and national level. And finally, another key factor of the guide is the fundamental role of affected women in the design and implementation of drug policies. These women have an experience that is really pragmatic, that is real, and it's very important that they are included into these debates and that they can talk about their experiences and see how drug policies have impacted upon their lives and how drug policies can be reframed to take into account these vulnerabilities and tackle them. Next slide, please. So the guide includes 7 thematic areas. I won't have time to go through all of them today, but I just wanted to mention them to you. So the first one is around promoting more inclusive drug policies, and that includes the implication of these women in the policy design and implementation. The second thematic area is drug policy reform, and I'll talk a bit more about this today. The third one is alternatives to incarceration, which is a key aspect of reducing the rate of incarceration of women. The fourth one specifically mentions cultivation and drug processing. It's not relevant to every country in the region, but in the Andean region in particular, this is a very critical issue, which we wanted to address. The fifth one is around social inclusion programs, and that's pre and post-incarceration. So pre-incarceration, trying to put together some programs that are based on socio-economic empowerment for women to ensure that they don't get targeted by drug trafficking groups. And post-incarceration, because many of these women, when they go out of prison, they face increased stigma. They can't find a job because of their criminal record. And so having social integration programs post-incarceration is critical, and I think the Costa Rica experience that is going to mention later today is very important in that regard. Number 6 is women who are pregnant and have other dependents, whether it's children or elderly people or people with other dependencies. And the 7th one is data collection and analysis, which is a problem throughout Latin America and many other countries in the world for that matter, because we don't really know who these women are, except for some of the great research that has been done by NGOs around the region. So can you click on next? So I'm going to focus on 3 key areas today: drug policy reform, alternatives to incarceration, and pregnant women. Next. So the first item that I wanted to mention in drug policy reform is the problem of decriminalization. So we know from experience from all around the world that people who use drugs in general, but women who use drugs in particular, especially pregnant women who use drugs, face incredible stigma and discrimination in accessing healthcare services, in accessing treatment, in accessing prenatal care. So there's this incredible problem of stigma and discrimination against these women. For women, it's additionally important because they are seen as carers and they have a traditional role in society. So the fact that they are using drugs kind of breaks with that traditional role that they are playing in their communities and society in general. So what we have been pushing for in Latin America within that guide, but also worldwide, is to remove criminal sanctions for drug use. We've seen from experience from all over the world that criminalizing people does not have a deterrent effect on levels of drug use, but it has extremely bad impacts on their levels of healthcare, on stigma, on access to employment, access to education, etc. So that's one of the key recommendations we have in this guide, removing any kind of criminal sanction against people who use drugs. Next. The second one is ensuring proportionate sentences. So across Latin America, there are extremely high penalties associated with drug trafficking. In many countries, there's not a lot of difference between micro-trafficking or higher level trafficking. And that means that women who are caught at the lowest levels of the drug chain get incredibly high penalties, which can sometimes be higher than penalties for rape and murder. So we see an incredible disbalance and in terms of proportionality of sentences. And the problem is that even in some countries where there are some differences between micro level and higher level drug offences, is that all of this is only based on quantities. And what we've seen with women involved in drug offences in Latin America is that sometimes they do have quite a large amount of drugs, but they are still in a situation of incredibly hard vulnerability and they have absolutely no responsibility or leadership in the criminal chain. So what we're trying to promote here is proportionality in terms of the quantities of drugs involved, but they also need to be based on the level of responsibility of the person and on the use of violence, whether they're not, and also any other kind of vulnerability factors. So, being the sole carer of a child, being in a situation of economic, social vulnerability, etc., etc. So there's a lot of factors that need to be taken into account. As Paolo already mentioned as well, ending mandatory minimum sentences is incredibly important to ensure proportionality because mandatory minimum sentences mean the judge does not have the leeway to take into account all these factors. And finally, in terms of proportionality of sentencing, legal frameworks do need to ensure that the judge has the possibility to lower sentences and to promote alternatives to incarceration. Moving on to the next slide. And I'll go very briefly on this one because Paolo talked a bit already on pretrial detention and the excessive use of pretrial detention in many countries across the region. And especially for drugs offences, because drugs are considered as serious, and so drug crimes are considered as serious crimes. So most countries actually mandate pretrial detention as an obligation. And the problem is, in some countries, there's a crisis in putting a lot of people in pretrial detention means that they stay in pretrial detention for months, sometimes years. So we promote the elimination of the obligation to hold people in pretrial detention. And we also promote very strongly that pregnant women or women with dependents should never be put in pretrial detention. There's other solutions that are available, including house arrest, including supervised release, and these should be considered for these women. Next slide. Alternatives to incarceration. So as I said, this is one of the key factors of trying to decarcerate women for low-level drug offences. And the problem is, so Paolo mentioned that, for example, in Mexico, there are some alternatives to incarceration for pregnant women. The problem is that because drug offences are considered as serious, in many countries, drug offenders do not have the possibility to access these exceptions. So that means that these women stay in prison, even if they are pregnant, even if they're in a situation of vulnerability. So we're promoting here the removal of any kind of legislative or practical obstacles that keep these vulnerable people in prison. And something that we also promote in the guide is that we want to guarantee that any kind of first-time offender of minor drug offences, which are not using violence, then can be diverted into programs that really try to address the social and economic factors that underlie their involvement in the drugs trade in the first place through multi-sectoral networks of support. Next. So now just finishing in terms of pregnant women and women with dependents. I think here in terms of promoting a human rights-based approach to drug policy, we are very strong in terms of the principle that we should never use prison for pregnant women or mothers convicted of non-violent drug offences. And something else I wanted to highlight here is that any kind of policy that promotes or encourages or pushes for more stigma and criminalization of mothers and pregnant women should really be avoided. And that includes compulsory detention, that includes the loss of custody of one's children. It includes interruption of pregnancy, for example. That's very common for pregnant women in some countries. They just, you know, if they use drugs, then they're going to be pushed to interrupt their pregnancy just because they use drugs. And, you know, so on and so forth. So any kind of policy that increases stigma and discrimination against them. Next. I'm going to finish here. So I just wanted to mention here the human face of the problem. So I've showed you a photo project earlier. So I've showed you one of these, but we've got many others that tell the stories of women incarcerated. So far we've interviewed women in Costa Rica, in Colombia, in Argentina. We're going to interview a couple of women in Bolivia as well. So I encourage you to have a look at these stories, which are incredibly powerful and really underline all of the vulnerabilities that women face. And I think this is it from me. So in the next slide for that one. Yep, that's it. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Marie, for this very powerful testimony that you have showed us, and by putting a human face to the challenges faced by incarcerated women for drug offences. And also by sharing these very important recommendations of the guide, and I encourage everybody to check on them. We will now continue with Luciana Paul. Luciana is a representative from SAIS, Argentina, and she will be referring to possible mechanisms to redress the issue of women, drugs and violence as a critical human rights issue within Geneva-based human rights bodies, such as CEDAW and in the post-UNGASS context. So Luciana, please.
Thank you, Cristina. Well, after this I believe very complete overview of the problem that gathered us here and that caught our attention in our case during our day-to-day work in things related with police practices and with prisons in Argentina, not looking specifically for this topic, we found a very compelling and serious situation that kind of diverts our attention to this problem almost 10 years ago. So it is for us a very important path that human rights organizations, together with drug organizations, people from justice operators from justice systems got together in this project. It has been really a long way for us, and we are very happy. We've seen some developments. So I would like to reflect with you a bit and maybe open for discussion later. Where are we in terms of this topic and the drug policy debate in general? What do we have in the immediate term? What are the possibilities? What has to be done here in Geneva? What has to be done in Vienna? And how we can complement those two processes? So as you know, we come from a very important year where the UN system decided to hold a special session to discuss what are we going with the drug policy in general terms. I think we could say from the civil society human rights organization perspective that special session left us with mixed feelings, in terms that we have come to openly discuss many topics, and this of women incarcerated from minor drug offenses is a perfect example of topics that were kind of hidden. They were not very there was not much attention on them before, and the special session, we believe it helped bringing many of these topics out to light and discuss it with a more open view of what could be the possibilities. not only civil society organizations, but most importantly, many UN agencies contributed to this special session with expertise, expert reports, and expert views. Some of them were referred by the expositions before. One of them was a very important report made by the Office of the High Commission of Human Rights. The Human Rights Council also passed a resolution. We had a debate panel on the topic. UN Women contributed as well. The program, the UNDP, has a very important also contribution in the topic of development. So we have all those expert views on what are the impacts or the consequences in other areas of the implementation of the drug policies. But at the same time, we feel that there's, at the present, after the special session, we are faced with a kind of incoherent responses from different UN bodies to this topic of the drug policy. We've seen that the agencies that are focused specifically on drugs, on drug policy design in Vienna, have maybe not fully incorporated a complete human rights and gender perspective in the design and implementation of their policies. So at this point, and after that first special session and big debate had happened, we believe that from the civil society point of view, we need to strengthen two processes at the same time. The first would be the design of drug policy with a human rights and gender perspective. That happens naturally more in Vienna, where the specific agencies are located. And there are some advances over there. Last March, the CND, the Commission on Narcotic Drugs, passed a resolution that is called Mainstreaming a Gender's Perspective in Drug-Related Policies and Programs. And that resolution has two important components that are related to the topic we are discussing today. One is to urge the member states to implement programs that are aimed to prevent women and girls from being used as couriers. So this is a specific mandate for the UNODC to implement policies to prevent this situation we just seen. And the second point is the development of judicial strategies to find alternatives to incarceration, specifically for the cases that Marie was mentioning. One is the case of pregnant women, and the other is the case of carers of children, minor children, women as well. So the UNODC has acknowledged this problem, had tried to develop some gender-based recommendation to the states, and that is an important step ahead. But on the other side, we think that there are another process that we, civil society and EU member states and specialized UN agencies need to strengthen. That is the development of the expert views on specific topics that are related to the drug policies. One is the human rights expertise view on human rights problems related to drug policies, and the other are the gender policies that are addressed to these populations. So for these two expert views, we believe that it's not enough what Vienna or the delegates in Vienna could develop, because it's not their field of expertise. The experts on women are in the women bodies of the UN and the treaty bodies also, and the experts on human rights are mostly located in Geneva. So we feel that there's a need still for these two expert views to contribute to the design and after the implementation of the drug policies. How we can do that? In the area of human rights, Human Rights Council and also the Office of the High Commissioner, together with the special procedures and the working groups, we believe that we had a very important first step. We had a very important technical contribution to the special session, but there are many, sadly, the areas of human rights that are affected by the drug policies are so many that now we believe we fail to advance in a specific and thematic to document some specific human rights that are affected by drug policies. I would mention just a few examples of areas that maybe they are not still so well documented by the human rights system. One would be the militarization and violence associated with the traffic. So now the situation in Central America and Mexico are extremely dramatic. We are talking about levels of homicide and homicide violence that have no parity in other parts of the world, even war zones. So we believe that that is one of the topics that as a humanist need to address. The reduction of violence should be one of the concerns of the human rights bodies. Also, I think there are many cultural rights affected. There are numerous indigenous populations and communities that have the traditional practices affected by the prohibition. The coca leaf, the Rastafari religion related with cannabis use, etc., etc. And also this topic of the women, the specific implicances of or consequences of the prohibition on women. And the fact that we are seeing those cases of women couriers take us to the question of why the women are mostly used as couriers. Why, if you visit a women's prison, you see that almost 7 out of each 10 women are there for being specifically used as drug couriers, where if you go to a man, that proportion is noticeably lower. So there are some specific dynamics of the criminal market that takes the women in the first place as being used as couriers, that we can talk after. But those are topics that need to be fully documented and fully investigated by the human rights and gender women agencies. At the CEDAW, in particularly, we have the satisfaction and in other women-specific agencies, we have the satisfaction of seeing the incorporation of some dimensions related to this topic. In the periodic evaluation of the countries, it has been raised the question of the incarceration of women, and countries have been asked to give explanations on how it is rising, why it is rising, etc., etc. So that is a very positive topic. We believe that this guide that we are presenting today could be a very useful tool to evaluate the implementation of the General Recommendation 33 on access to justice. Paulo mentioned this at the beginning of his presentation. Also, now CEDAW is working on the General Recommendation on the update of the General Recommendation of Violence Against Women, and we believe that this is a topic that is worth incorporating in that update. And finally, the situation across the world, I think, will justify the reflection on a general recommendation on women in prison. We have been seeing in the last 10 years how the amount of women incarcerated are growing and growing, specifically in Latin America, but also in other areas of the world. So we believe that we have to address this topic because it gets more and more serious. The gender issues, the gender aspect of this problem is not hidden. The profile of this woman, as the one we've seen, and the others that you can, and everybody who visited the jail can see, are very similar to the profile of the women who are victims of human trafficking. So we are talking about extremely vulnerable situations that end up being even more serious when they are incarcerated for years. So we call the attention on that, and we believe that there are a variety of mechanisms that we can use to redress this problem. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Luciana. I think I would like to highlight from your presentation the the importance of mainstreaming human rights and the gender perspective in the work of the UN bodies, especially the importance of having Vienna and the bodies dealing with drugs in Vienna working more closer in cooperation with other specialized UN agencies. I think we will all be winners if we get this to work properly. So now I would like to, last but not least, to invite Ambassador Maria del Pilar Saborío de Rocafort. She is the permanent representative of Costa Rica in Vienna. The ambassador will be sharing with us the experience of Costa Rica in incorporating a gender perspective in its national drug policy. So, Ambassador, please, you have the
Yes. Hello? Can you hear me? Yes, thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. It is a pleasure to be part of this panel. I'm Pilar Saborío, permanent representative of Costa Rica to the UN in Vienna. This is a topic that needs to be discussed time and time again until the mindset on traditional drug control policy changes and evolves into an approach that balances the need to protect society from damaging behavior and the need to promote positive, healthy behavior whilst minimizing the negative impact that law enforcement policy has had so far. If there's anything that the UNGASS process taught me, is that indeed we need to keep talking about this because the positions, the state positions, were very, very different. It was a very difficult process. Every word in that document, in the outcome document of UNGASS, was fiercely fought for. I know civil society wasn't fully happy with it, but believe me, we tried our best. Okay, just to give you an idea, at some point, some of the positions we had, at some point, a member of a delegation from a country that is not here today said at some point that drug addicts consume drugs because they did not believe in God. Right? So, that gives you, so now you can see that the document, was actually a very positive result if you start from that. I'm here actually to share what Costa Rica is doing to try to reverse that trend, right? So if we can go to the slide. So in order to do so, let me give you a bit of background so you can put in context what we have done as a country to incorporate the gender perspective into our drug legislation and into our institutional approach to the drug phenomenon. So as you can see on the slide, what you have there is actually the different legislation we have had in the country and how it evolved. In 1988, legislation was enacted in response, funnily enough, to the commitments undertaken under the third UN drug convention. There are 3 of them, as a matter of fact. So interestingly, prior to this date, drug regulation in Costa Rica was under the responsibility of the Ministry of Health. So it was actually seen as a health issue. This legislation, however, superseded any other legislation that we had previously and criminalized and defined drug offenses for the first time. And for the first time, it stipulated prison sentences, prison terms. The problem with it is that it contained a broad and sweeping definition of drug-related offenses and made no distinction whatsoever between a woman, let's say, that introduced 2 marijuana spliffs, joints, whatever you want to call them, on a visit to her partner in jail, and a drug trafficker that smuggled, a ton or 500 kilos of cocaine into the country. They were perceived as the same offense. It was a one-size-fits-all law enforcement approach. And then it stipulated stipulated mandatory prison sentences of up to 20 years with a minimum of 8 years, and it did not take into account any extenuating circumstances such as, first-time offenders, non-violent offences, or the drug, the quantity of drugs involved in the offence. In other words, there was no proportionality whatsoever between the offence committed and the type of prison sentence. It must say, however, that this legislation also reflected international, the international law enforcement approach to the drug phenomenon at the time, which was called the drug problem, not phenomenon. And a lot of pressure that we received in the form of being, let's say, put as a country in blacklists of non-cooperating countries, let's say other bigger countries or trade partners. The 1998 legislation, again, contemplated a mandatory sentence it was the sentencing, but it still might contemplate a mandatory sentencing of between 5 and 8 years. But this legislation expanded the typology to include money laundering. And again, in 2002, it changed to include financing for terrorism. But again, none of these, this legislation contemplated alternatives to incarceration for first-time offenders. Okay, so what? In 2013, Costa Rica introduced an amendment to Act number 8204, which is the one that typifies drug offences. Okay, and which was aimed at reducing penalties for women in vulnerable conditions who introduced drugs to detention facilities. Right. So in this amendment, there was therefore the recognition of gender conditions in drug-related legislation and policies. There was the reduction of jail sentences from 8 to 20 years to 3 to 8 years, and then it contemplated alternative sentences for women in conditions of vulnerability, poverty, or those providing primary care for dependents. 150 women have, who at the time in 2013 qualified for application of the amendment, and of those who actually benefited from it and are out of jail, less than 1% of them have reoffended. This is very, very important because, for those who say, oh no, people, who want to persist on having a punitive approach, this actually shows that amending the law and introducing proportionality, taking into consideration vulnerability and so on, actually works. If this is not some lofty ideal. It actually has, practical positive implications, not only for the population, but actually for, let's say, for the state in terms of cost reduction and so on. It's a far more positive and productive approach. So, what changed? Why did we see the light, if you want to say? Well, the first thing, obviously, our international commitments under the Bangkok rules and the Tokyo rules, but also, frankly, with the realization that the purely repressive and punitive approach not only didn't diminish the problem, but it has a series of serious social unintended negative consequences that penalize not only the offender, but her dependents as well. And why do I say this? Because, for example, the vast majority of female detainees in Costa Rica must leave their children in the care of relatives and in highly vulnerable situations. Vulnerable because those taking care of them don't necessarily care for them or do not treat them in this, equally as they would treat other children in the family and so on. So who are these women? Let me give you a bit of the demographics. To illustrate the point, let's look at the demographics of female detainees in Costa Rica. And over 78% of them are under 44 years of age. In other words, they're women of reproductive age. 90% of them are mothers, and with an average of 3.15 children. And 64% of those children are under the age of 18. 27% of them are homemakers, 18% are in trade, and 18% are domestic workers. But interestingly, when it comes to education, 20% did not even finish primary school, 20% finished primary school, and 23% of them finished 1 or 2 years of secondary education. Okay? But very few of them, and only 14% had over 3 years of secondary education. So as lower, let's say, levels of education, it's a key characteristic that they have. What do they do in the detention facilities? Well, some of them select what to do, about 14%, but almost 44% of them actually engage in training courses. Sadly, 80% of them is the first time that they have been in jail. It's the first time they're incarcerated. And 57% of them are there because of drug offences. Okay, serving a prison of between 4 and 9 years. And 80 actually, of those 57%, 81% of all women actually, are currently serving a sentence in relation to either drug production, trafficking, or selling. So in addition, as you can see on the slide, we had in 2012, this is important because remember the amendment is implemented in 2013. 65% of them, and now you have that. Sorry, I've got this presentation from different ones that I had. So yeah, this one says 65% of them were serving sentences for drug-related offences, and 120 of those 780 women were convicted for smuggling tiny amounts of drugs into detention centers, to their boyfriend and so on, or as you say, mules. So what are we doing now? I mean, where the amendment takes into account 4 criteria: poverty, the fact whether they're heads of households and in conditions of vulnerability, if they have dependents, or if they're over 65 years of age. It's important to say here that the judge has discretionality in determining the weight of these conditions. But beyond the criteria that is now applied to drug offense cases, there's also the recognition that conditions of vulnerability are at the heart of the problem and the root for the commission of the crime. Has created a network in which relevant state bodies or agencies work together to address those conditions and support offenders so they can overcome the vulnerabilities they face. So we have created a support network that provides a response to various situations faced by these women. And very important here is part of this is giving them the idea, these women, for the most part, as Luciana has mentioned before and Marie, have come from a life of violence and abuse. So it's very important to give them a life project, together with building their self-esteem, to give them a life project. What is it that they want to, why is life worth living? What is it that they want to achieve? Sarah was an example of that. Yeah, okay. So, of those women, as I said, most of the women in prison are in there because of drug offenses, followed by theft. We are looking at who the program is aimed at. Well, you can see there that it's aimed at women with mandated child support payments, because even if you're in jail, you still have to pay your child support, or often you have to pay support for elderly parents and so on, or for even a partner. So, and it's aimed at the women that benefited from the amendment. And in 2013, when the amendment comes into force, 159 inmates were released from detention centers. And then we have the institutions that together coordinate the support that they give to these women. So, so the state network, for example, works in addressing issues in the following 4 areas: financial hardship, limited income generating opportunities, and violence, and also linked to criminal organizations, and addiction. And these, what you see there, I don't know if you can see it clearly, but that's the network, all the different state agencies that are involved in the network. So the INAMU, which is the Women's Institute, for example, provides empowerment courses that are 6 months, take 6 months, and they're designed by psychologists from the institution to build self-confidence and to provide and teach them decision-making skills and awareness. So they're able to become that aspect of their vulnerability. Building their self-confidence and self-esteem is very important. They're also provided with guidance on how to make use of other state programs. The INA, which is the National Teaching or Training Institute, provides them with skills training. So, for example, they often choose computer and IT courses, mechanics, for managing, cooking, or admin jobs, sort of to become receptionist, and English. As a matter of fact, which in Costa Rica might be quite interesting because it would allow them to go into to work in the tourist industry, which is very, very large in the country. Now you also have the Office of the Public Defender, who's in charge of following on their cases, and the Institute for Public Assistance, which provides housing benefits, scholarships, school uniforms for the children, school materials. Then the Institute for Drug Addiction, and provides addiction therapy. I have to admit here, however, that these programs are provided from 7 to 3 p.m. But drug addiction is a 24/7 issue. It's not something that you can, that you only have from 7 to 3. The Institute, the ICD, the Institute for Drug, financial support that comes from this assets seized from drug traffickers, the big ones have been, and the Ministry of Justice and Peace, that is actually in charge of sentencing, the Supreme Court, and very importantly here, the Vice President of the country. Why? Because frankly, political support for any of these initiatives is key. Okay, without it, you cannot change really, and that is perhaps a very important message that we have to get out of here, and that we saw at UNGASS. We fought at UNGASS. Some countries wanted to limit the definition of scientific evidence. We have plenty of evidence that the traditional approach hasn't worked, but unless the state actually accepts that, you will not start changing policy. So again, under these institutions, we have a series of initiatives that I don't know if we have time to go over, so if not, I'll skip them. Okay, so again, I basically referred to this in the other slide. You need the legal framework, you need the political support to change the legal framework in order to, therefore, let's say, lead to, and help and create the necessary institutional arrangements to actually provide, let's say, alternatives to incarcerations and to actually make the programs work. Without the coordination between institutions, it doesn't really work. this is just a slide that gives you information on the what type of support the network is offering to 122 women. I mentioned earlier there were 158. Some are not there because, for example, an obstacle is that originally, in order to participate, to be given, for example, the housing benefits and so on, these women needed to provide a permanent address, and often they don't have one. So I'm just giving you, for example, one of the practical obstacles that can be, work against, let's say, a program that otherwise it's, it's designed with the best of intentions. These are details that we need to pay attention to. Okay. So to get to the end, I mean, what are the challenges that we still face, and what are we doing? I mentioned two of them. For example, the need for a permanent address, or I mentioned the fact that someone with a drug addiction problem who might seek help might only be able to find it between 7 and 3 p.m. and not necessarily at moments of crisis if they happen outside of those times. Or, again, and so another issue now, so what are we working on apart from the penal reform to expand the figure of proportionality and alternative penalties for young people, whether male or female, okay? And to develop, policies that increase human development in communities vulnerable to their geographical location, along trafficking routes. And in this point, I refer, let's say, to the indigenous communities, which are in the most remote areas of the country, where the state doesn't have a strong presence. Right? And frankly, they're difficult to reach. But yes, that they suffer because of that. Because drug traffickers then put pressure on their blood either to grow, marijuana in the Costa Rican case, and force people into an activity that they are not interested in. And lastly, again, to strengthen the national system for the prevention and treatment, okay, of demand reduction, and ensuring an ongoing debate on the existing strategies, revising them, seeing what's working, what's not, right? And so we're now hopefully working on and it's being discussed, eliminating criminal records for vulnerable women, but that hasn't happened yet. And also there's a proposal that we're working on to amend the law, again, to take into account mitigating factors for all microdealers and apply alternative measures to all of them, okay, irrespective of gender. And so in conclusion, as it's quite clear that the traditional criminal approach is not working, and so it has created more problems than it solved. And if we're truly committed to making progress in this area, we must go beyond ideological and political stances, of which there were plenty, I have to admit, and base our efforts on evidence-based and thorough scientific research that takes into account the interaction of the social and biological conditions. And in that, I commend the work you do. The guide is a very good, very sound, social science work that you've done here. We may not be able to, we may not be certain yet of the results of the new alternative approaches, but we have plenty of evidence that a purely law enforcement approach to what is, in essence, a social and economic problem, not only doesn't solve it, it creates a string of new ones. We must dare to think. That might be a quote, it's my favorite quote, might be a bit harsh, but there's plenty of truth in it. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ambassador, especially for sharing the national experience of Costa Rica, also the evolution that the legislation and the practices have had in your countries, and especially to show that the inclusion of the gender dimension to the policy they work, And I think that sharing these best practices are very important, in particularly what you mentioned about showing evidence. This is a way good of doing things. Well, I have to thank all the panelists for their very insightful presentations. And I will open now the floor for us to have a space for comments and questions from the audience. So please feel free to address any of the panelists or share your thoughts or comments. Colombia, please, Ambassador.
Thank you, Cristina. In the first place, I want to thank the panelists for their very good and illustrative presentations. But I need to highlight a couple of things about not just the presentation, but the problem that we all face around the world. As Rodrigo Uprimi from the Justicia in Colombia, that's well known and quite involved in this, says, we'll probably see in the next future many changes within a given region, a given state, even a given province or a given city. And it's a difficult discussion worldwide because there is a lot of politicization, because there is polarization, because the political changes are also showing us how difficult it is to be, let's say, more in favor of more progressive policies around the world. Second is that definitely your presentation, and particularly I thank also the references to the guidelines and to the ambassador of Costa Rica in Vienna, of the Costa Rican experience. We in Colombia generalize, and you ask a woman or a man, why are you in prison or why you were in prison, and say late 30, low 30, late 30. Independent of the size or the importance of the criminal offense. And this just shows that everybody is treated in the same way and proportionality is not existing, and replicability of the sentence is quite different from one judge to the other. The second point that I really like to stress is not just for us. I think for most of the countries, and that's why I celebrate a lot what you, Ambassador Sorillo, were mentioning, having good data about, not just about the women in prison, it's about the families and the costs of having that woman in prison, what it means for the society, what it means for the dependent, what it means for the state to take care or to help the communities that are affected by women in prison. Having good data and having data that is reliable, timely, that is disseminated to the public, that is useful to the authority, but also to the people surrounding the women and the people involved in this, would be a good step to extremely conservative policies. This is not poetry, and you don't sell this if it's not with good information. And good information is necessary, and I think in the region, with very progressive policies, we are lucky to have better data. And better data in the guides is, they also mentioned the segmentation of the data and the sources of the data, that is difficult to find out good sources, integration of the sources, and analysis or compiled analysis of the data that is collected. The no differentiation of the criminal also puts everybody in the same basket, and it is against human rights as well. So it's a very vicious circle. And that takes us to the necessity of creating or educating society that not every criminal offense is the same. And in the case of some of the other countries or some of the countries in the region with crops, with coca crops, for example, or marijuana crops, is substitution of crops is part of the policies, and women have to be taken into consideration as well, because many of them are punished and end up just for survival, just to make their living. They end up in prison as a result of some state policies or government policies that are not reaching the most marginalized population in the countries. In the peace agreement that we have reached with FARC, this has been included. Probably not to the point that we would like to see, but we are going to be like a lab somehow, and not probably we don't see as much as we like to see it, because FARC are very progressive in terms of seeing this like a public health problem, etc. And substitution of crops, they for consumers, when they are very conservative. And so you can see the tension even in the text, the peace agreement that we have signed, both agreements actually, the one that we signed before and the new one as well. The last point that is the indicators of success. What is success? How do we measure success? What does it mean? Is not to have people in prisons or those who go, is because we are able to really resocialize and help them properly according to their own needs and the needs of the society. And second is what is success in this world drug problem affairs. Many countries are trying to remove, or some countries, let's say, some countries are trying not to take into consideration what was reached in UNGASS. And the outcome of the UNGASS document, we have many good things that not what we expected, but we have made progress, and we need to take the best of that document that was agreed by countries in New York and is now present. And let's find out new venues. Let's be innovative. Let's try to find out how we establish more positive dialogue with colleagues from other countries in order to see if we begin to find common paths to go into I couldn't say the right direction, because it's not because we are right or the others are wrong. It's to take the path of more respect, more dignity, more possibilities for the people, both consumers or offenders, to be in the mainstream of society and looking into a more humane way. If that's the word that I probably like to use. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ambassador, for your powerful comments. I will now give the floor to the delegation of the city.
Thank you very much, Christina. Thank you to all panelists as well. This is truly a passionate topic. As if what you said is not enough, we count on the remarks made by our ambassador from Colombia to highlight even further how important it is to address this issue at the Human Rights Council. I should not be, but I was impressed by the number of intersections one could establish between this topic and human rights issues. Right? So far, to my knowledge, we've had just one single resolution adopted by the Human Rights Council on this specific issue, whose aim was to provide inputs for UNGASS. And we have different opportunities. We could apply different strategies to highlight that interconnection between the world problems and human rights issues at the Human Rights Council. One could draw parallels between this issue and discussions that will take place this year, by the way, on mental health and human rights, on the rights to health, on administration of justice, on extrajudicial killings, on well, in any case, it will not be a problem of finding appropriate venues and opportunities to address the issue on a more comprehensive fashion, because there will be plenty of them. And we also have the opportunity to choose one, two specific approaches as part of a new resolution. I'm just speculating, of course, but this is something that could also be a venue for further consideration of the topic by the Human Rights Council. I take it for granted that your preference would be to use as many alternatives as possible to address what seems to be an extremely important and complicated issue. But in any case, I couldn't resist to ask you the question. In your view, what would be the we will have to prioritize? What would be the most effective ways to put in the agenda an issue that might elicit some concerns, as the ones that were expressed by the ambassador of Colombia? Yeah? Not so many countries would be sympathetic to that, while at the same time could provide a meaningful contribution to how this problem is being dealt with here in Geneva. Thank you.
So I will take somebody else from the floor, and then I will invite the panelists maybe to answer the question raised on Mexico, please.
Thank you very much. And thank to the organizers for bringing back this topic to the table, which I think it's very relevant to see it from the human rights perspective. And even though we know that it's a global problem, I think it's important to see that there's this Latin American regional leadership, because I think many women in our region are affected by this. And I think one of the first steps to address the problem is to understand what's the profile of the incarcerated population, which Ambassador Saborio and Pablo, I think, provided us in a very accurate way. A few years ago, I had the opportunity to serve as a consular officer in our embassy in Peru, and part of my task was to study the profile of the Mexican population there in jail, which was very relevant for us because Peru is the country in the world with the largest Mexican population in jail after the US. And while we were doing this study, we find that the same topics that you mentioned were repeated again and again. Women were sentenced for micro-trafficking, no violent crimes. There were no criminal records for them. And then the answers that were given to this problem were not very helpful in the long term because they repeated a vicious circle. And incarceration, for example, didn't provide rehabilitation, which shows the failure of the criminal system in this particular cases, and reinforce to a great extent the vulnerability and exclusion from context from where these women are coming from. So I think that one of the first steps is to give back a voice and a face to those who live in the shadow, and after being incarcerated, just became a statistic, like what we saw in the photo exhibition. So I think that's a very relevant point. And I think this giving back a voice and a face can only be done from the human rights perspective and the gender perspective. Also from the lens of consular protection, I think it's very important from those women incarcerated abroad. And then I think that one of the most important points that were touched upon was that we need to find alternatives to incarceration, which I think we can learn a lot from the experience from Costa Rica. And this can be done through the reform of the criminal law, and then also from general strategies for social inclusion, which might be a little bit harder to implement in the long term. But finally, I have a technical question to Paulo. During your presentation, you mentioned that lawyers usually recommended to women who are under trial to plead guilty. And I would like to know what you're feeling about this, because I have the impression that when all evidence points to the fact that the crime has been committed, even if it's smuggling of short or small amounts of drugs, then it might be better to plead guilty because this might be the way to get shorter sentences. But I want to know what you're feeling on that. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Would you like to identify yourself?
Sure, thank you very much. I don't have a small thingy who says that says who I am, but actually I represent the International Network for Human Rights. It's a small NGO here in Geneva that, of course, works for human rights. One of my main concerns as a gender project officer is specifically on how states address criminal system, because of course we're not talking about only policies but also about legislation. So if we have, for example, this idea of that the jail is the answer, right, and there are not alternatives to jail, and then when we don't have a specific minimum penal law, no, we're all prison is the solution. Actually, in Ecuador, as the same of the countries that you've mentioned, 80% of women are in jail because of this micro traffic. So not only that, we have tried to see what the problems are and how to gender mainstream and to have a human rights perspective. It's very hard to actually have, as you said, political will, because women are not only incarcerated but because they're trafficking, but also because they're having abortions. So it's a general system, it's a whole idea, it's a mindset that is still there, not only in the society in general, but also in our authorities. So it's so glad to see people here that represent their governments and they have a strong commitment to women's rights and girls and teenagers' rights. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Yes. Go ahead, please.
Thank you. My name is Robert Husbands. I'm with OHCHR. I want to thank the present persons who made the presentations. They were very interesting. I have one observation that's related to the presentations, but more broadly. It's a comment that's more broad. I think the question now is how we bring this process forward. And as I understand it politically, there's not a desire to have this as a regular item on the council's agenda. And you know, this whole issue has always been troublesome because people in Geneva who don't like this subject say, well, this is for Vienna, and people for Geneva. And my conclusion is human rights is a Geneva issue, period. And where there are human rights violations, no matter what the subject, it has to be dealt with first and foremost in Geneva. And so I just have a practical, or some practical suggestions to states. If there's no appetite or there's not the political support for having this on the agenda, there's nevertheless the possibility of having this subject addressed in other form. For example, the office makes a report to the council and the General Assembly every 2 years on the administration of justice. So why not have, for example, why not include in a report on that resolution, you know, experiences on alternatives to prison for drug users and micro dealers, with particular reference to the Bangkok rules, so to generate positive experiences for states to look at as an alternative to these, you know, minimum 8 years of prison for you know, minuscule amounts of distribution. I was actually discouraged because I know that in the resolution on the working group on arbitrary detention, there was actually a proposal to have a discussion of the conditions of people subject to arbitrary detention. And that's a setback, but it's important to keep trying, I think. And certainly in the right to health, there's plenty of space for continued contributions to ask about the right to health for people who are suspected, charged, or convicted of drug-related offenses, in particular how women and juveniles are dealt with, and also what measures were taken to prevent HIV/AIDS and other communicable diseases. And there's even in the new Nelson Mandela rules, there's a specific mention of treatment for drug dependence in prisons. So I think there's a lot that can be worked at. So, and I think it's important to build up a series of reports so that the subject is dealt with in Geneva from various angles, and hopefully it will be dealt with eventually in another comprehensive report.
Thank you very much, Robert. I think that you have already answered one of the questions that was coming from the floor, but yes, please, Ambassador.
Briefly, Robert, you know how much I like you. but
Okay.
today I have to express my deep disagreement with you that human rights is Geneva and period. Because I think human rights is exactly what we need. They have to be present in every place, in every organization. New York, Vienna, Nairobi, Bonn, or Geneva. And beyond, of course, the UN. But I will continue. I hear you a lot, but please, because this is exactly what we need to understand, that Geneva has a role, Vienna has a role, that we need to work together, we need to complement each other, we need to do our best to create bridges communication, respecting, of course, the roles that each organization has at some point. Otherwise, it will be a deaf dialogue in the future, and that's exactly what I think UNGASS is a good opportunity for us. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ambassador. Yes, I will take the last person from the floor. I'm sorry for that, but we don't have that much time, and I would also like to invite the panelists to wrap up like in 1 minute each with a key message before we close. So please go ahead.
Thank you. My name is Olga Guzman. I'm from a Mexican NGO called Mexican Commission for Defense and Promotion of Human Rights. I would like to thank your presentations because they have been very inspiring and they have shed light on how the criminal justice system policies are affecting women, particularly and their families. And that raises also the question whether, like, if it's actually the use of drugs that is affecting our societies, or it is the policies, security policies specifically, that are affecting our societies. In the Americas, which is my perspective that I have here, is harsh security policies are generating a lot of violence, extrajudicial killings, enforced disappearance, torture, forced internal displacement are happening in our region because of these draconian security strategies and policies in our countries. So I think, like, I would agree with all of the interventions that have been raised here, and it is that the Human Rights Council should actually have a more serious discussion and analysis on how to address these issues, not regionally but internationally, and to bring more the special procedures on this discussion, and even like think about in the future whether if it's necessary to create a new mandate to supervise and monitor the human rights cost of security and drug trafficking policies implemented in the country, in the region and internationally. That's it. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I invite some of the panelists to 1 minute, maybe address something that has come from the floor or give a key message to close the meeting. So we will start with Bob.
Thank you for your question. It's very touchy because actually I was on the situation of not advising both men and women in prison. I think the option of plea bargaining, and that was the point I made, was an option to be discussed with the attorney and client. And we have seen that on many occasions, women do not have that very option to think about the best defense strategy. It may be indeed a good window of opportunity to. The point is that when it's automatically suggested to a female inmate, then it becomes a bit we see the right of judicial defense, I guess, a bit just very simple.
Thank you very much, Paula and Marcelo.
Thank you. Yes, a couple of comments. Brazil, yes, Vienna looks at drug issues. This is also a human rights issue. So, it should be included in your agenda, which I have to admit, do not know. But this is yet another way in which humans are, a segment of society is marginalized further. And it's a segment of society whose rights, frankly, have been abused from day one. Okay. The comment by Mexico in terms of, actually, when it came to UNGASS, there were very different positions from the Latin American region. And in a way, often they reflect how conservative society is. So whilst there were approaches that were far more progressive and more aware that we needed to do things differently, others, whether they were because of society in itself is conservative or because of political stances, were very much against doing things differently. I had a country, a big country, not from Latin America, but a big country, in fact, who the ambassador of that country admitted to me that he said, "Oh, I don't know why we agreed to UNGASS at all. They simply were not interested in it." And then another big country who sees drugs as an external threat. It's perhaps as admitting that they have an internal issue in a very large consumer population, is to see it as if this is some type of state failure, as if the state is not taking proper care of its citizens. So the approach they have is to see it as an external threat. We don't have a problem. We have a threat. Okay, so that is something to keep in mind, and why, therefore, the work you do, hammering again and again, it's important on evidence. Because there's a saying in Spanish which roughly translates as, the worst type of blindness is the refusal to see. Well, let's help people. Let's buy them glasses. Okay? So I think with that, I'll leave it there. But go on.
Thank you very much, Ambassador.
Thank you, and thanks very much for the useful comments and questions. I just wanted to get back to your question in terms of what Geneva could do, and I think Geneva has a very important role to play now that governments are leading towards 2019. So 2019 is the moment when member states are going to meet again, probably in Vienna, to discuss the evaluation of the political declaration and plan of action on drugs of 2009, and most probably design the new political declaration from 2019 onwards for the next 10 years. In 2009, the objective of the political declaration was to create a drug-free world. We all know now that that has not taken place, and that everything that's happened has shown the impacts that it's had on women in particular, but also on entire societies. So I think the UNGASS has been a very important starting point for UN agencies to start engaging in the debate for the first time. There's always been like parallel universes between Vienna and Geneva. The UNGASS has been a moment where both universes have finally collided, which was very, very positive. And I think we need to continue building on the momentum that was created at the UNGASS to make sure that UN agencies in Geneva continue to engage in the debate, continue to send very useful written contributions, as the OHCHR has done, as other UN agencies have done, for example, UNDP or UN Women, but also that they come to the meetings that are taking place in Vienna. So, for example, right now, there have been a series of intercessionals in Vienna to discuss the post-UNGASS process and how to implement the UNGASS outcome document. And I think, Robert, you were there, but I think a lot of UN agencies should be there. UNDP was in there, UN Women was in there. Some of the special procedures should be there to also present how drugs interact also with their mandate. So for me, that would be a call from all of you to try and engage more in the debate, and obviously we're happy to help and happy to support you in that process.
Thank you very much, Maria. 30 seconds, Luciana. I'm sorry, but we have to leave the room.
I will cut to 30 seconds. Thank you very much for every comment. I think that there are some expertise that we can expect and we would encourage to be produced in Geneva. It's not that human rights should live in Geneva only, exclusively, but yes, maybe some contributions should come from here, because here is where the expertise are located. And the same to say about the experts on women topics. And we are doing this side event today because today is the session, is finalizing the session of the CEDAW, and we wanted to have a dialogue with them as well. So I would agree with some of the comments that were made, that the progress now is thematic, and the thematic can be from special procedure experts, could be from working groups, could come from interested countries with special initiatives, from thematic report from the Office of the High Commissioner. We chose the topic of women because we believe it's one of the topics where we need to advance a little more. So I believe that Geneva has a very, very important contribution to make to the process of the implementation of the, let's hope, a new policy. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I would also like to pass my message because I represent you, and we have been engaged with several other countries in different initiatives here in Geneva at the Human Rights Council, but also at WHO. So there is plenty of room to contribute to the work of Vienna, but it is very important for us that Vienna also works with Geneva. So it has to be in both ways. It is very important. At the end, if we don't work together, we are not going to make any improvement on this very important issue. So I would now like to close the meeting by thanking everybody for your very interesting participation and attendance. Special thanks, of course, to the panelists and the supporting missions, as well as the organizers for this event. Additional thanks to the International Network for Human Rights for their support. So thank you very much.